Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is pupil performance data in 2022 and what effective governance oversight of that actually looks like. My name is Steve Barker, and that's me on the left-hand side of your screen, and together with my colleague Linda Waghorn, who's on the other end of the line. Morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
Linda and I are both from Better Governor, and it's our pleasure to be facilitating this webinar on behalf of Governors for Schools this morning. And this is your session, so please, any questions at any time, then do actually use the question and answer box, and we will actually deal with as many of those as we possibly can. And if we don't get through to answering them all during the session, because there are rather a large number of you here this morning, then of course we will get back to you after the session electronically, if that's okay. So with no more ado, we will actually start the webinar. The aims of this session this morning, first and foremost, are to explore what performance data is actually available this year in 2022. And it's not a typical year. We haven't gone back to pre-pandemic organisation just at this point in time, but we'll be focusing on what assessment and examination data there is available to us as school governors. We'll be thinking about how governance overview of pupil performance data is a vital part of what we do, but must encompass both internal, in other words, school-only data, as well as having that overview of external data as well. And what we try to do as we go through most of our webinars is actually focus on the sort of questions. We're not giving you a boilerplate or anything like that, but what we try to do is suggest the kind of questions that as governors, perhaps informed by the data, we should be asking in our schools, in our trusts, that actually deepen our knowledge, but also are a strategic overview of school effectiveness, because ultimately, of course, performance data is about school effectiveness. So that's what we're going to try and cover in the session this morning. But just a reminder, this is your session, so any questions, comments whatsoever, and just to be clear, the slides will be sent out to everybody attending the session this morning after it's over. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk you through the first few slides.
Thank you, Steve. So against that backdrop, we're going to first of all look at some of the information that is available for us to perform our job as governing board members, and then we're going to concentrate on how we actually do that, what it looks like in practice. So first of all, we'll start with thinking, what is it we mean when we use that term pupil performance data? Well, largely when we're talking about this in an overview sense, we're thinking about a performance data that is a set of statistical information showing how all pupils, either all pupils nationally or all pupils in our own school, performed in those statutory assessments and the public exams that they take at given points in their educational journey. So what do we mean by that? Well, most of us will be governors either at primary level or at secondary level. But public examinations relate to what happens in secondary schools, and the statutory assessments for children in primary school. So these are those key things that we know that take place in our schools in the summer months, and the results, the evaluation of that for each pupil is collected, and it ends up in a set of statistical data for our pupils against those given points in their journey, at certain key points in their age and stage of their education. And this is supported by the collection of the school's own internal assessment data. So each pupil is tracked at school level with the progress that they are making in their learning across the weeks and term by term, and that information you will receive again in a statistical format, so that it's not about individual pupils, but you will be able to see how pupils are doing in their learning by the collection of that internal assessment data. So we're talking about data that allows us to look at an overview, but behind all of this, particularly national data, there are individual contexts for schools. There are groups of pupils who will do better or who will have more need for support in their learning, and those will become those groups of pupils that we would look at in more detail. So again, thinking about this as a set of data that then is behind that is individual pupils, individual schools, and we need to be aware that we understand how we make those comparisons, what that information is to be used for, and how it will help us be better at our governance role.
We've got a couple of questions on the panel, Linda, already, which I think are probably worth actually picking up here. There's several on the same theme, but one of them is from Justine. Thank you, Justine, for your question. And Justine saying that her school had an Ofsted inspection a couple of weeks ago, and the inspector told her that data wasn't important, and I should know that the school is doing without reference to data. I don't know which, none of my business which inspector it was, but I think that's a little wide of the mark. That's not what Ofsted are actually saying at the moment, or not what they should be saying, I should say. Ofsted absolutely in this framework say that they are not interested in looking at schools' own data. But of course, as Linda's already said, all of the data we've got, any of the data we've got informs us as governors, but informs the schools as well. And the idea that schools are not assessing youngsters and using the information from that is just nonsense. That's not what the Ofsted framework says. So I would suggest that maybe the words that particular inspector chose were not particularly appropriate. But the key thing for us, of course, as Linda's just said, isn't the data itself, but it's the messages that lie behind that. But we don't get to understand what our school priorities are without having the background of that very basic data to actually look at.
And I think there are a couple of slides coming later in this session where we'll absolutely pin that down a little bit more in terms of what you will actually be doing, and therefore how that informs a conversation that you have around the learning of each individual pupil. And that is the story that Ofsted is expecting you to be able to tell. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And some of the why are you doing it is informed by, because our internal assessment data and our performance data is telling us that this is an area where focus is needed, or that improvement is being made by the steps we put in place. So it is the way in which we measure what we're doing and how effective it is in helping all pupils do as well as they possibly can in the time that they are with us at our schools. Did you say there was another question, Steve, or was that a kind of general question that picked up 2 or 3 inquiries?
Yeah, no, there were several on the same theme that we've covered those, though.
That's fine. So keeping at that top level at the moment, there are, as you are probably well aware as governors, a number of different sources, both that you may have seen or that this may be new to you, and depending on your stage of education in terms of what context, secondary or primary, or a variety of primary that you are a governor or a board member in. So just to unpick some of these acronyms, just so that it is a little bit more helpful if we refer to these things as we go through the session later on. ALPS is an A-level performance system. There is data in the system that also takes us down to GCSE level. It is a subscription service, and schools, it's a very popular subscription service, and the schools provide their own data into the system, but it allows you to see how you rank nationally in terms of the quartiles of the top 25%, or broadly in line with the national or in the bottom 25%. So a good place to make some of those basic comparisons. The local authority collects data on each of its schools, and if you're a maintained school, may provide information back to you that allows you to see how you are doing as a school in terms of your performance in comparison to other schools in your own area. Your own school data is collected and shared with you at board level. The analysed school performance is that DFE collection of information that is shared. And remember, we will talk about this in a little bit more detail later on in the session, but this has been affected by the pandemic, and therefore the published information is not yet back to where we were when schools closed early in 2020. So public examinations, as you remember, and statutory assessments were halted, and therefore the collection and the publication of those pieces of information has been affected by that. We'll say a little bit more about that shortly. The DfE's website, Find a School or College, that is rich with all sorts of data, lots of it benchmarking against quite a number of different aspects of data, staffing and the like, but it also does contain some performance data. And your inspection data summary report. Steve will talk about this in quite a bit of detail later, about how you might use that. That again is published for your individual school by the DfE and gives you a variety of information. And lastly, Fisher Family Trust, a subscription service. And if you are in a multi-academy trust, you will have your own trust data. And depending on the size of the trust, that could be shared in a statistical way across the whole trust. So there's a variety of information that is available to you. Many local authorities buy into the Fisher Family Trust subscription for their schools. So it is worth knowing what it is that is available to your school that allows your school to make to do that analysis, and therefore the information, how that is benchmarked when it is shared with you as a governing board. So thinking about how the Department for Education has collected and shaped their information, there are a couple of pieces of guidance that are available. And the caveat here is, if you look at the primary accountability, you'll see it's labelled as a technical guide. So certainly not bedtime reading, but it does provide some very good information and has a sister document, secondary accountability measures. And this is largely to inform schools and governors, if you're a particularly data-driven individual and you want to find out about this, how this is constructed and what information it contains, then by all means, these documents are available for you to have a look at. But the important thing here is not that you use this as bedtime reading. In fact, we would caution against that. But this is, look at the summary possibly in these, and we'll give you some tips in a moment. But this is really just to help you understand the background behind the exercise that we expect governing board members to carry out in their governing board meetings. So the guidance, the summary of the guidance, and it is a guidance, it tells you what is collected and when it is collected. It outlines the methodology that is used in collating that information together and how the point scores are calculated. So again, some of that information may be useful for you to explore in a little bit more detail, but the important thing here is that it is the background behind what we expect governors to do with it.
I mean, there will be governors, I think it's fair to say, who are interested in the methodology if you happen to work in statistics or data, etc. But as Linda says, this is not the prime focus of us as governors. Some of your schools will have people who are immersed in data and who actually live and breathe data, and they probably would quite like to actually talk you through this as governors yourselves. But the strength of this data is that this is just explaining how it's put together. What we should be doing is looking, as Linda says, of the headlines and actually asking our questions based on those, rather than drilling down into the methodology, because nothing's going to change on that. The government decides how that's done. So this is all very much cast in stone, really. It's just there as an explanation of how it's done.
And and Steve and I've probably mentioned this on some of our webinars before, don't get involved in the distraction activities. If you've only got a limited amount of time to really look in detail at pupil performance, do it in your board meetings. Don't spend that precious time, unless you're particularly data driven, in doing a lot of this background reading and then not have the time to look at your own reports for your own school and ask those detailed questions about the children who are learning in your organisation. So let's have a look at what's actually being reported in 2022, and let's start with primary. So the SATs data from this summer's exams is not going to be published. So it's only available at individual school level. Published data will return next year. So we'll be looking, this time next year, we'll be looking at those comparisons in the same way, in a similar way, not the same way. I would caution against anything being the same for a little bit longer, but the published data will return next year, and we'll make those comparisons. We'll be able to look at those sort of national details in a little bit more detail than we can this year when it's only headlines. Each school will have received its own data in the summer, and the inspection data summary report, there have been produced for schools. Certainly in the primary school where I'm a governor, we have looked at the inspection data summary report for our school, and Steve's going to take you through how that might be achieved a little bit later in the session. This is the first data for 3 years, so we need to be really careful in the way we look at it this year. For secondary, there's a resumption of publishing that exams data, so we have got that data from this summer, and it is being published, but there is a caveat on making judgments from any of this 1 year set of data, and schools are being told that they shouldn't base appraisals and pay decisions on just this one set of data. So as I say, it's the first data for 3 years. It follows quite a level of disruption to pupils' learning, and a different way of assessing the outcomes for those pupils moving on at GCSE and A levels. And so this is the first time for 3 years that we've got this, and we do need to be cautious about the way in which we draw any conclusions from it. So let's look at the headlines for primary. And again, my caution here is this is the national. When we're looking and making comparisons of our own school performance against these headlines, we need to think carefully about our own context and our own pupils. But just the headlines from this will show us that in 2019, the last time we had published information, we are down from that combined figure of children meeting that age-related expectation in their combined reading, writing and maths. There's a downward turn in some of the in reading, and we have an increase. We've dropped back with our slide set, Steve. I don't know whether that's something you can address. Thank you. So the percentage of pupils reaching that higher standard has dropped from 11 to 7. And if we're looking at those children who are disadvantaged, and you will know this from your pupil premium discussions, we know that that COVID impacted on those pupils more greatly. And we can see here that that gap between how well children from that disadvantaged group perform compared to their peers has increased. When we look at those subjects drawn out individually, we can see that reading has actually stayed around the same as it was before the pandemic. Writing, particularly writing at length, has dropped down in comparison to 2019. And again, we see a similar drop in those pupils meeting the expected standards in maths. So these are the headlines across the whole country, but it is important for us to understand what, and we will have been having these discussions over the past 2 years in our board meetings, how this has impacted in our own schools. There should be no surprise in the information that we receive from that data. We should have been aware of and analysing and having conversations around what our expectations were at this stage, and this should be broadly in line with what those expectations are. And more about that in a few moments. So let's look at the headlines with secondary. And again, these are the headlines. And we're looking at pupils who were across all of the subjects who were able to get a grade 4C and above, which is the equivalent of the old GCE. And if we look at these headlines, we will see that actually the impact of the pandemic on these pupils' results for this year don't appear to have shifted much in comparison to before the pandemic. So I think there is a caution to be exercised here, and we do need to be very careful when we're looking at our own data, because we are looking at the impact on our pupils in the context in which we serve.
I think it's worth adding in there, Linda, as well, and secondary governors who are joining us today will be aware of this, I'm sure, but in 2020, of course, we didn't have examinations conducted the way they had been in previous years. We had what were called centre assessed grades. Last year it was teacher assessed grades. This year we have gone back more or less to the system that we had before, but again, slightly modified. So hence that caveat on the slide that Linda showed a couple of slides back now. Yeah, we need to exercise extreme caution in making any judgments or parallels on this and saying, oh, well, we're back to where we were pre-pandemic. That's not really an appropriate judgment to make. So I think the comparisons of the benchmarking starts from 2022, all being well, and we now have no major resurgence of pandemic or anything else for that matter next year. It will be more reasonable to compare what our schools achieve in 2023 with what they've achieved this year, rather than looking any further back than that.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, Steve, there were modifications to the exams this year, and
exactly.
we don't know whether there are going to be any modifications next year, maybe not. So even comparing this year's results directly with next year's results will be a little bit more tricky. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and we're going to conduct a poll.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Just before we do that, one quick question on the panel at the moment, or comment on the panel. Somebody called LG, sorry, you just put your initials. We don't tend to give people's full names out. But the comment is you can see clear grade inflation during the pandemic. That's a big assumption. It may be grade inflation. It may well be a reflection of the way in which the exams were conducted. Lots of youngsters in GCSE and A-levels as well missed out on huge chunks of the curriculum, so they were only tested on things they'd actually done. So again, I think it's not necessarily fair to say it's a clear indication of grade inflation. That may be an element of it, but again, for an awful lot of schools, and I'm guessing an awful lot of governors in secondary schools here this morning, pupils will have actually performed very well in those situations. They were moderated last year and the year before. So grade inflation is not a significant factor in my view here. The variations have got more to do with the fact, and you might be aware that a lot of the big teaching unions and the head teacher associations are saying that the way in which the exams were conducted last year and the year before was a lot fairer way of doing it. So there are different perspectives on all of these, I think I would say on that. Okay, so let's move on to onto the poll at this stage. Sorry, I'm just about to launch the poll. So we're going to launch the poll. The question is a very simple one. Has your board, your governing body, actually looked at, reviewed the 2022 national data and compared your pupil performance to it? So what we're talking about is those headline figures that Linda's actually just taken you through. So the GCSE figure, if you're in secondary, and obviously the English, maths and writing scores if you're in primary. So that poll should be launched in front of you now. So hopefully you can see it, and I can see people voting already, so that's great. About 75% of you have voted now, so that's good. We'll leave it open for a couple more moments just before we close that down and share the results with you. Okay, I think that looks as if everybody who's going to participate has now, so we'll close the poll and hopefully that will share the results with you. So a resounding 69% of you, which is fantastic, saying yes, you already have looked at those headline figures. 70% have said no, and 14% have said they don't know. Now, the 17% that have said no, that may well be because you've got a governing body meeting coming up later this term, i.e. this week or next week, what's left of it. But of course, in secondary specifically, the validated data certainly isn't out yet, and probably the more detailed analysis won't be available until after Christmas, it looks now. So we don't forget about it. Obviously, the more time that elapses from when young people actually took those public examinations, and obviously the less relevant it becomes. But we should always be looking at that data from a lessons learned perspective. If you don't know, then it's a good question to go back to your governing board and ask, I would suggest. But sorry, I've just realised I didn't share those results. I've just seen the button flashing at me. So hopefully you can see those results on the screen in front of you now. Okay, so I will stop sharing that and cancel that poll out, and we'll crack on with the other slides. So, sorry, did that a little bit too soon there. Obviously, what we need to think about as governors is actually how we use data. And I think a feeling that Linda and I both share on this is that the data itself, and Linda's alluded to this already, is the starting point. It doesn't give us answers, generally. What it does, though, for us as governors, and what it should do for us as governors, is fuel or inform our questions. So the data will show certain things, but it doesn't actually give us that full understanding. And what we're going to do on the next few slides is go back and talk in a little bit more detail about some of those data sets that Linda shared with you, the top level data, and think about the sort of questions that as governors we ought to be asking about this data, and the way that that actually informs our strategic oversight of school effectiveness. So again, the questions on this slide really are, they can be focused on primary or secondary. The questions are actually very similar. But of course, whenever we're exploring data, when we're asking our questions, we have to recognise that our role as governors or trustees is always a strategic one. So it's not for us to delve down, as Linda mentioned earlier, into that individual pupil level data. If we're parent governors, to talk about our own children, etc. This is about school performance. This is about that strategic all pupil overview. Now, of course, the data that we've shared with you, that Linda's already talked about, is about national averages at this stage. There's not much else is actually going to be produced this year other than in secondary, where we'll drill down into a lot more detail. But in primary, we're not going to get much more than that. So we've got the headline figures on the left-hand side, that 59% of pupils at the end of Key Stage 2, so the end of Year 6, who reached what is the expected standard. So people talk about ARE, age-related expectation. The percentage of pupils nationally who reached that age-related expectation in both of the English subjects, reading and writing, and maths. In other words, this is the combined one, 59%. And then similarly in secondary, on the right-hand side of the top there, we know that 73% of pupils achieved a grade 4 or above across all the subjects that they entered. So the key question for us in all of our schools, irrespective of, well, not irrespective, but thinking about whether you're primary, whether you're secondary, is how do we compare to that national average? Now, that's an absolute question, of course, and we have to think, well, okay, there's a numerical response here. Well, the comparison is if my school was at 64% on age-related expectation, reading, writing, and maths combined, that on the face of it looks like a pretty positive picture as far as the national average is concerned. And similarly, if your GCSE rate was at 81% compared to 70% national, that's notionally pretty good. But how does that compare in terms of thinking about your context? And we've got governors from all over the country joining us today, which is lovely. But every school will have its own story, will have its own context, and it's vital for us as governors to actually understand that context. And let's just say, if you happen to, your school happened to be, let's say 64, 65% at age-related expectation at the end of year 6 on reading, writing and maths combined, yes, that does look very positive against the national average. But how does that compare to similar schools? How does that compare to the context of your school? If you have a very small number of pupils with special educational needs and disability, tiny percentage, if any at all, with English additional language, all of those things are indicators that might suggest that perhaps our schools ought to be achieving slightly better than that. Part of the context, of course, as Linda's already mentioned, is, well, how did COVID impact on our school? What was attendance like last year? How much of the curriculum content was not delivered? So all of those things are contextual and will have an impact on those outcome figures, but also the comparisons that we make. Now, again, slight caveat on this, as Linda's already said, the government is saying we shouldn't make direct comparisons to the 2019 data, but that is the benchmark that we've got. Before the pandemic, we know where our school was in 2019. And we're not making any any kind of definitive statements on this, but it is perfectly reasonable for us as governors to actually look back and say, okay, so what are the challenges that we face now as a school, be it secondary or primary, in comparison to those in 2019, and what impact has that had on that data? Now, the data set that we showed you for secondary, rather, 73% in 2022 compared to 67% in 2019. On the face of it, that looks like a pretty good bit of movement from a national perspective. But it's not as simple as that. And I think the important thing for us as governors, as trustees in individual schools and trusts, is to ask those questions. Tell us about the context so that we deepen our level of understanding, and then put those results basically into a frame so that we actually understand really what actually brought those that particular set of results about. And of course, the most important question that we ask is there any learning that comes out of this year's data? Are there things that we might want to do differently for perhaps next year's year 6, next year's year of 10 and 11, depending on when they do GCSEs in your schools, etc. But what we want to do is not perpetuate the status quo necessarily. What we want to do is continually review assessment outcomes so that the school is learning, so that we're improving the progress in learning for all of our pupils, and we see that moving forward.
The only other thing I'd want to add there, Steve, is that when you're looking at that last bullet point, what actions is the school proposing to ensure this is not repeated? Think about what's on your school development plan or your school improvement plan for this year. Can you see that that strand as part of the activities that the school is engaging in? Because it should link back to that culture of no surprises that we mention so often. These results have been out for primary, your own school results, for long enough now for the school to have built those into the development activities for this coming year. And as governors, you should be aware of what information has fed into your school development planning, and that it then links with this information and you are already aware of and have planned for some of those improvements. Pupil premium strategy, for example, against that disadvantaged group of pupils. Is it building on what you already know from the data that you collected internally, but also from the results of these tests that have happened and given you data from an external source?
And of course, what we can't lose sight of is the fact that every year we are talking about a different cohort of children and young people. This year's year 11 are not the same as last year's year 11. This year's year 6 are a different cohort to last year's year 6. And the context for every one of those could, and very often does, change quite significantly. And it's important for us as governors to actually have an understanding of that, because of course that puts complexion on any analysis of the data that we are looking at. And the other thing to say here, of course, is we haven't actually mentioned Key Stage 1 at all, and there's never any published data per se on Key Stage 1. However, of course, national averages are known, and local authorities do collect data on Key Stage 1. They also collect data on early years. So for those of you in early years settings, hopefully you will know for your own setting what percentage of children at the end of the early years foundation stage last year reached what's described as a good level of development. So that percentage at GLD, good level of development, that is available not nationally, I'm not aware of it's nationally, but certainly at a local authority level, that is available. And then of course we've got additional data for primary in terms of phonics check, which is done at year 1 and repeated at year 2 if children don't reach the expected standard. And this year, for the first time, of course, we have the tables check at year 4. Now, tables check, the results of that have, there's been a few problems collecting the data, so I don't believe the official validated results are available yet, or they weren't yesterday anyway. So we will see that if you're in primary schools coming along very shortly. But those data sets are available as well. And again, context tables is a good example. This is the first time it's been done. It was planned to start in 2020, but of course was postponed for a couple of years deliberately. And again, similarly from a special needs perspective, you need to think about in your school, if you're a special school, what tests, assessment tests, but also what public examinations, if any, are actually being undertaken. And that's part of your context, and that's the context under which you actually analyse that data. Okay, so let's move forward at that stage and focus on the inspection data summary report. Inspection data summary report, as Linda said, is available. It's produced by Ofsted. It's produced in league with Ofsted by the Department for Education, and it's taken on a slightly different format this year. As Linda said, it is out for most schools. Most schools have actually been sent this, certainly in primary. I've got an example here. Obviously, I've blanked out the name of the school because this is confidential data. This is not in the public domain at all, but this is a school that very kindly lent me their report on the proviso that I did actually blank out the appropriate identification. But this is just to show you there is some data available this year. It's not plentiful, doesn't go into huge amount of detail, but there is some data there. So the important thing is that the initial release, and this was actually only came out in October, as you can see here. This was actually the 19th of October, but the initial release was provisional phonics data, provisional Key Stage 1 data, and provisional Key Stage 2 data. And again, as we said a few moments ago, only at a national basis. So there's no real breakdown here. There's a little bit of breakdown, which you'll see on the next few slides. But so the concentration of the data is actually pretty limited on this report at the moment. You should be aware that it's actually in your schools. And obviously as governors, we want to know that school leaders are actually looking at it and aware of its content, because certainly this is something that if you're expecting an inspection, inspectors will look at before they come into the school. And again, we've got a very similar caveat on the bottom here that Ofsted have put on. Performance data for 2022 should not should not be directly compared with 2019 and earlier, nor should comparisons be made between schools. This is because, etc., what we've already said about COVID. So again, you will see that as a consistent theme coming through. Doesn't prevent us, and it shouldn't prevent us asking questions as governors, but we should be very guarded in the conclusions that we draw from that. Okay, so what you will get on your inspection data summary report, or IDSR as it's very often abbreviated to, is that summary for your school. And of course, I say of course, if you're not already aware, what the inspection data summary report does is make notional judgments about your school's performance in comparison to those national average. Now, they will do a lot of statistical significance tests on it, and they will come up with conclusions that actually relate to whether you are significantly above, significantly below, or in line with national average. So what you can see here on the left-hand column in this little screenshot that I've taken from the IDSR that I was given access to, first column on the left-hand side, you've got the three core subjects at primary: reading, writing, and maths. It's telling you the next column that is the 2022 data that we're actually looking at, and obviously you can see that in the title of it at the top. The first one that we've got, and this tells you, of course, that this is actually a through primary school that we're looking at here. So we'll just go across on the reading line, Key Stage 2 progress measure. And of course, progress is absolutely key, because what progress is saying is, given the starting points, and again, lots of your schools will have children with special educational needs, etc. And start points are very important. So progress is the key measure, because that says, well, for all of those different start points that children come into school with, how much progress from there on to it. So this is a true measure of how effective learning is in that school. Attainment, which is the next measure, is really saying, okay, did they reach the bar that was actually set by the government? Now, that bar for some youngsters, again, particularly some with special educational needs, not all, but some children with special education, are never going to reach that age-related expectation because of their particular needs. So when we're thinking about attainment, we have to be very guarded, because again, that's where context is absolutely everything. So one of the schools where I'm the governor, we've had a couple of children actually join us this year who are over here from the Ukraine, came in with very little English at all. So their opportunity to attain the age-related expectation was always going to be in question, but the progress that those children have actually made is immense in the short period of time they've been here. And that's what schools should be celebrating, of course. And the data doesn't allow you to do that. So as I say, this is where we come back to the idea that data doesn't give answers, it actually fuels our questions. So you've got the Key Stage 1 attainment data. Of course, there's no progress data for Key Stage 1 because Key Stage 1 is the start of a national curriculum. It's not possible, and it would be entirely wrong to compare outcomes from the early years foundation stage with outcomes at the end of Key Stage 1, because it's not the same curriculum. So progress measures only come into play at the end of Key Stage 2, and then they are relative to Key Stage 1 attainment. So let's just go across that line then. Key Stage 2 progress, saying here that the school is actually in line with the national average, and it's telling you how many pupils actually took the test in this particular school. If you drop down onto the next line, you will see for writing that the middle box on attainment there, this particular school was significantly below the national average. Now, there's 76 pupils took the test there, but again, we've got a figure there, and the box is highlighted in orange. Ofsted stroke DFE do that. That's nothing to do with me at all. Just to point out that in this particular school, performance was significantly below that national average. And then again, you've got all of the others are actually in line, so there's nothing really of note here. But this is probably, if you're in primary school, this is the key chart to look at, because this will tell you, again, only on a very, very top line basic level, whether or not your school was significantly above, significantly below, or in line with the national average. Now, of course, then there's a whole host of questions that we should be asking about that. And similarly, of course, we've actually got the phonics attainment. I mean, it's a line for reading only because it's related to reading. It's not actually part of that at all. But of course, the phonics check, as it's called, it's not an assessment, it's called a phonics check. For most pupils, that is actually conducted when they're in year 1. Some pupils that don't reach the standard, as I said a few minutes ago, do it again in year 2. And this is the cumulative figure at the end of Key Stage 1, so at the end of year 2, that is relative to the school here. And I'm not aware that the inspection data summary report is out for secondary schools yet, because secondary data, as I say, is not available at this point in time. That should be immediately after Christmas. But when you get your secondary data, when you get your data, if you're in a secondary school, it will be laid out in a similar fashion. But of course, there we've got things like progress 8 and attainment 8, and the 8 purely refers to the highest performing 8 GCSEs, and the scores are actually averaged out over those, but that's a separate issue. And ideally, I think Linda and I would both say that if you are a governor in a secondary school, your leadership team should be sharing the data with you and should be explaining how those calculations are actually put together.
This is often a presentation that somebody in the school will do to the governing board to actually take you through the data summary report and allow you to ask those questions and make sure that you have a deeper understanding of that.
Yeah, and again, forgive me, I can't remember the name of the person that raised the question earlier, but the question about Ofsted said we shouldn't focus on data. As I say, I mean, that is not true in my view at all. It really isn't. One of my schools was inspected this year, and absolutely we were asked about data. The key thing to remember about the data, of course, is that we are there. We are using that data to actually inform our questions, and as governors, what we should be thinking about on this is using the information that we've got. What does that actually tell us about where our schools actually going in the future? So we've got some questions on the next slide, which are suggestions of things that as governors we might actually want to be asking. First one, of course, is about the factors influencing performance. Specifically in writing, because obviously that's the one where we've actually pointed out on that inspection data summary report that it was significantly below the national average. Now, many of you will know, of course, that writing generally has been acknowledged as the subject in primary schools, certainly those that are nationally assessed, where most children struggled to actually make the progress that would ordinarily be made of them during the pandemic. And of course, that's because even working remotely, those that weren't in school, it's very difficult to do that sustained writing in the same way they would if they were in a classroom. It's not being directly monitored as such. So there's no big surprise there, but again, it's worth actually scratching the surface of this in our individual schools to get to understand, well, what have we done? How did we use catch-up premium? What are we doing in terms of bringing about recovery? Have we got any additional groups in place, etc. for that? Again, if you don't know, and so everything comes back to context here, of course. And the second question is, would we expect the school to be in line with the national average in reading, maths and phonics, which it was on the previous slide, of course, or actually, given our context, and Linda's in Sussex, I'm in Surrey, the averages for Surrey as a local authority, and I'm guessing it's probably the same in Sussex where Linda is, are significantly higher than national averages for obvious reasons. So if you compare yourself with the national average, it might be okay, but is it okay when we're thinking about what the average for our local authority area was, or is, I should say?
And again, one of those things that sits behind that is, are we being ambitious? We're looking at more pupils doing more with their learning and achieving better outcomes with all of those contextual pieces of information taken into account, and with all of those planned activities in our school, including how we use our pupil premium strategy to address some of these gaps if they continue to exist. So yes, I would totally agree with Steve that my area in Sussex, we have done well compared to the national average, but we're not complacent because we have a number of challenging groups and some individual pupils in our school for whom the next year will be a vital part of their education. So we are aware that we are ambitious, and we continue to have those high expectations built into what we're doing, and the data will help us measure, our internal data, whether we are doing what we want to do in terms of that ambition.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I can see there's a comment on the panel from Peter. Peter's saying IDSR for our secondary school was issued on the 16th of November. People may not have to wait till after. It was issued on the 16th of November, Peter, but my understanding is there's nothing in it at the moment because the data hasn't been released. It will be updated, and my understanding from certainly the secondary school where I'm chair is that that update is actually not going to happen. I think it's due on something like the 7th or 8th of January, somewhere around there. Apologies in advance, I've just realised I've actually made a typo, or not a typo, I've been lazy on my next slide because it's got the wrong title on it. it should say attainment, not attendance. I think I just didn't check my spelling, so profuse apologies. So ignore the title. This still is from the Inspection Data Summary Report, a primary one, of course, and this is a new element of the report for this year, and I thought it would be useful just to give you a brief indication of what this actually says, but more importantly, perhaps what it means. So this is actually looking at other areas of attendance other than just those individual subjects, English, maths, and writing. So you can see we've got two measures that are being referred to here at the top of the slide in the black bold type. The first one is Key Stage 2 grammar, punctuation and spelling. EGPS is English grammar, punctuation and spelling, and then combined reading, writing and mathematics is the one on the right hand side. So again, it's giving you, if you like, that top level judgment for Ofsted make by looking at the data and saying, is it in line, is it significantly above, is it significantly below? And again, nothing unusual about this school. Both are in line with the national average, and it's telling you the number of pupils again, and obviously those correlates for numbers that we're doing individually English subjects of reading and writing combined with mathematics on the previous slide. So nothing really of any note there. And then, of course, what it's giving you underneath, and the blue, it looks like it's a URL. It doesn't work as a URL at the moment. That may well change in future. That's just the title of it. But it's telling you for the 3-year trend, again, the same caveat about this, the 3-year trend of where the school has been historically from 2017 up to 2019, both on the grammar, punctuation and spelling measure and on the combined reading, writing, maths. So what is got by Q5 down to Q1, that just means the quintiles. So in other words, all the schools, divide them equally into 5 groups of the same size based on where the results were. Where does your school come within that? And you can see that this particular school is in the 4th quintile, but nonetheless, they all fall into the not significant. So they're broadly in line from a statistical significance perspective with the national average. And you can see for the reading, writing and maths combined, those little boxes, grey boxes at the bottom there, for 2017, it was a slightly lower, one quartile lower, but again, in that mid area. So throughout, this school has been no significant difference from the national average as far as those 2 additional measures of attainment are actually concerned. So you can see when we said at the beginning, there's not much information in the inspection data summary report at the moment, and that won't change until next year, until we get the 2023 data. But nonetheless, we should know what the messages are contained within that, of course, as we said earlier. I can see there's a comment from George on the panel. It would be good to compare our performance to our local authority subset. Are local authority headlines available to governors? That will be a mixed picture across the country. I think most local authorities, as far as I'm aware, George, do actually collect that data. They have an obligation to collect that data. The extent to which it's shared with schools is something you actually need to ask your own school about, I would suggest. But certainly in my area, and I'm sure Linda would say the same in hers, yes, the local authority does share that data.
Yes, absolutely. I'm in an academy, but the local authority does make that information available, so you can make those comparisons. But it will differ from local authority to local authority, I'm sure.
Absolutely. As I say, key is, if in doubt, ask at school, because they will certainly be able to tell you. Oh, sorry, George, I've just seen here. Yeah, you've just done so well. Well done. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the last couple of slides. So really focusing on internal data. Now, Linda said right at the very beginning, internal data, of course, has been one constant that hopefully we've all had for the last 3 years since 2019, when we didn't have any of the national data, etc. But of course, again, we have to set this against that Ofsted expectation. Ofsted tell their inspectors they must not look at internal data. But, and it's a huge but, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't as governors. And I think the key thing for us as governors is that culture of no surprises that Linda and I often talk about, and I'm sure we've mentioned here on Governors for Schools webinars many times in the past. We don't want to get surprises when our SATs results come out. We don't want to get surprises when our GCSE, A-level and other associated public examination results come out, because we want to be kept, and we should be kept, up to speed on regular updates from teachers in terms of their teacher assessments, but also their predictions on where they believe SATs test results are going to come out, GCSE results come out, and so on and so forth. And it's really important for us as governors that right the way across the board, we are getting that information available to us, because as governors, we can never lose sight of the fact our core business is children and young people's learning. And if children and young people are not making progress in our schools, something is going wrong. And the only way we get to know if they are making progress in their learning is if we actually ask that question and we look at that data. And that really is absolutely crucial here. So we should be looking at teacher assessments on where we are in phonics. There's a huge focus at the moment on early reading, and the importance of reading is a focus in Ofsted inspections, not just in Key Stage 1, but in Key Stage 2 and also in secondary. And so we want to know about children's ability in reading. If it's relevant in our setting, then we want to know where we are assessment-wise in terms of those checks, the phonics checks, and as I mentioned earlier, the multiplication tables checks in Year 4. We want to know where we expect to be, Key Stage 1 SATs, Key Stage 2 SATs. We also want to know, as I've said about public examinations, but also don't forget, when we're thinking about assessment, it is crucial that we know as governors that all year groups in our schools are also making appropriate progress and are attaining, hopefully where they can and where they're able to, the levels that are expected of them in comparison to the requirements of the national curriculum. So we should, on an ongoing basis, be getting progress and attainment data for all year groups in our schools. And again, I saw an Ofsted report for a school, I think it was early part of this week, where governors were actually criticised because they didn't know anything about the attainment or progress in anything other than core subjects. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should be becoming experts in all of these other subjects. That's not our role, but we should be asking questions. We should be provided information from our schools in terms of where children and young people are in their learning in those other subjects as well. And of course, always, if performance is below expectation, there will always be reasons why. Some of them will be very good reasons. If it is illness, if it's COVID or things related to perhaps the high wave of absences this week because of concerns over Streptococcus A and other things associated with that, then as governors, we should always be asking the so what question. Not just so what, because that's actually quite rude as a question, but so in this case, so what are we doing about it? So what are we doing to ensure that those children who've missed 2-3 weeks of this term are going to be able to catch up and they won't be disadvantaged by missing that amount of time? And always, as governors, we should actually be looking to the future, and where do we think we're going to be? And again, I go back to the early years. If you have a cohort of youngsters in your school this year who, because of the impact of COVID and the limited experiences that they had before they came to school, only 50% of the year group at the end of year R, reception year, reached a good level of development, what that shouldn't say to us as governors, that doesn't augur very well for SATs results in 2 years' time. What it should say to us as governors is, okay, we know that only 50% reach good level of development. What are we going to do about it as a school to ensure that that doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy in 2 years' time? Similarly, Key Stage 1 results impacting on Key Stage, end of Key Stage 2 results in 4 years' time, and again in secondary. Question from Pupil here: can teacher assessment in years 2 and 3 be robust and comparable? Yes, it absolutely can, and I would say yes, it absolutely should be. And as governors, we should be seeking assurance of its how robust and rigorous it is. And the comparability, I think schools, again, particularly in a multi-academy trust, I know Linda and I have talked about this before, it's something that happens in her trust, you moderate. So you look at how teachers assess work in your own school and you compare it with other schools across the trust. There are plenty of maintained schools. The infant school where I'm chair, we're a maintained school, but we collaborate with lots of other schools in our area to cross-moderate early years, levels at the end of Key Stage 2, levels at Key Stage 3, etc. So to look at what those expectations are to ensure that teachers do have common understanding, shared understanding, and it doesn't, it's not the luck of the draw as to which teacher you get, but all teachers share a common understanding, a consistent approach to what an appropriate piece of work should look like at the end of year 3 or the end of year 5 or whatever it might be. Okay, so really just in terms of pulling the session together, a few final questions to, I'll probably phrase this slightly the wrong way around. Firstly, to reflect on, I think if you don't know the answers, or if you're not sure of the answer to the question when you reflect on it, maybe to go back to school and ask. But certainly I think for all of us, we need to reflect on, do we see sufficient data? Now, it's very limited, the national data that we've got. Hopefully that's the message that we've given you today, but there is some out there. Have we looked at it? Have we scrutinized it appropriately? And for me, a key question is always, what am I going to take away from the data? I've personally done a lot of training over the years with head teachers and also with clerks, and but with governors as well. And the message that we always try and give is, well, think about what key message, if you're a head teacher, what are the 3 key things that you want governors to take away from this year's data set? If it's we need to improve boys' writing, we need to actually think about good level of development in early years, and we need to think about girls' performance in maths, that's great. They're your 3 messages. Yeah. Similarly in secondary, if it's about combined science, if it's actually about English literature, whatever it happens to be, those become those 3 key messages. Share them with class before the meeting, so class know what to focus on in terms of the minutes. That's our permanent record of that. But always think about, I've got my data, whether it's internal data or national data, what are the messages that as a governor I need to hold on to? And then I come right back to that question about Ofsted earlier. That's the use that data is. Data is actually saying, this is what we need to focus on as a priority. That's why it's in our school improvement plan. That's why it's mentioned in our self-evaluation document. But data is being used. I would always suggest, I haven't mentioned it this morning yet, but never describe data as interesting. If you describe it as interesting, interesting is a lazy adjective anyway, in my view. What we should be able to say is, that's useful data. And we can only say it's useful if we know it's being used. Now, if we know it's being used to inform next year's school development plan, that's brilliant. That's exactly what it should be used for. So again, on that flow rather, that's how we know what is being done to improve performance. We're taking the data and saying, what can we learn from this? What can we do? Hopefully, what we can do is put additional support where it's needed in place. And of course, then for governors, it's about focusing on the impact that that support is either already having or hopefully is going to have as time moves forward. And always that question, the great question for us as governors is what more could we do, what more could be done to improve that data as time goes forward. Okay, I do apologise, it's a couple of minutes past 9 o'clock, but that's all that Linda and I are actually going to share with you this morning, other than just a few final sort of pulling the threads together. This is all about accountability. Accountability is not accepting the status quo, as we said earlier. It is about asking what more we could do, and it's about remembering that data is not the answer, it is the fuel for our questions. And on that note, if you have any further questions, I know we've had a lot of questions. I hope we've asked Angela, that's very kind. You just said it's useful. That's very amusing. Thank you very much indeed. I hope the session has been helpful for you this morning, folks. As I say, if there are any questions, send those across to us and we'll certainly get back to you individually with some response to those. But that's the end of what we wanted to say today. Other than just to share with you, we've given you those 2 references for the primary school accountability and the secondary accountability measures. And a final slide, just to say thank you from Linda and me for joining us today. We hope it's been a helpful session. If we don't talk to you again before Christmas, which we probably won't, have a very enjoyable one. A happy new year, and we look forward to seeing you again in the spring term. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.